The air inside the Colleton County Courthouse hung heavy with the humidity of the South Carolina Lowcountry and the suffocating weight of a century-long dynasty on the brink of collapse. To the jury and the millions watching globally, the prosecution of Alex Murdaugh for the brutal execution of his wife Maggie and son Paul initially appeared reliant on circumstantial threads. The state presented financial ruin and opioid addiction as motive, yet they lacked the physical tether to place the weapon in the hands of the accused at the precise moment of death. The defense team, armed with a timeline that seemed to exonerate the patriarch, stood ready to dismantle the narrative through reasonable doubt. But beneath the polished veneer of legal arguments and expert testimony lay a dormant digital fragment that would shatter the alibi. Hidden within the metadata of the victim's own cellular device was a time-stamped video file, a piece of evidence so precise and irrefutable that it acted as a voice from the grave. This documentary dissects the moment that 50-second clip was introduced, transforming a complex investigation into a clinical dismantling of a lie. It serves as a stark reminder that in the theatre of justice, where perception often battles reality, a single overlooked second of data can possess the power to invert the verdict and reveal the devastating architecture of deception. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The humid air of the South Carolina Lowcountry hangs heavy over the swamps and pine forests of Colleton County, a landscape where visibility is often obscured by morning fog and the dense, tangled undergrowth. It is a place where history is measured in generations, where land deeds date back centuries, and where power is consolidated in the hands of a select few families. To understand the trial of the state of South Carolina versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, one must first understand the topography of influence that defined the 14th Judicial Circuit. For 87 years, from 1920 until 2006, the office of the solicitor, the chief prosecutor for a 5-county district, was held by a Murdaugh. 3 generations of men, Randolph the First, the Second, and the Third, occupied the seat of justice. They did not merely enforce the law. In the eyes of the locals in Hampton and Colleton counties, they were the law. In June of 2021, the inheritor of this dynastic weight was Alex Murdaugh. At 53 years old, Alex was a towering figure, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with distinctive red hair and a booming, genial voice that commanded attention in any courtroom. He was a partner at the family law firm Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elsroth, and Dietrich, known locally as PMPED. He was a successful civil litigator, a man who carried a volunteer solicitor's badge in his pocket, allowing him to traverse the lines between defense and prosecution, between civilian and law enforcement with impunity. To the outside observer, he was a pillar of the community, a wealthy scion living a life of country clubs and hunting excursions. But beneath the veneer of Southern gentility, the foundation was rotting. The context of the trial cannot be separated from the financial hemorrhage occurring in secret. Alex Murdaugh was in the grip of a decades-long addiction to opioids, specifically oxycodone, a habit that required vast sums of untraceable cash. To feed this addiction and maintain his lifestyle, he had been engaging in a complex scheme of financial fraud, stealing millions of dollars from his law firm and, more egregiously, from the settlements of his own clients, orphans, quadriplegics, and grieving families who trusted the Murdaugh name. By the morning of June 7, 2021, The pressure was critical. The chief financial officer of his law firm had confronted him about missing fees totaling $792,000. The walls of his double life were closing in, threatening to expose not just a thief, but a man who had betrayed the sacred legacy of his forefathers. Living within the orbit of this collapsing star were his wife Maggie and his youngest son Paul. Margaret Kennedy Brandstetter Murdaugh, known as Maggie, was 52 years old. She was a woman of social grace, dividing her time between the family's beach house at Edisto and their sprawling 1,700-acre hunting estate known as Moselle. Friends and family described her as a dutiful wife who was increasingly living a separate life, worried about her husband's health and the family's finances, yet unaware of the depth of the criminality involved. Then there was Paul Murdaugh. At 22, Paul was the chaotic catalyst of the family's public unraveling. 2 years prior, in February 2019, Paul had been at the helm of his father's boat while grossly intoxicated. The boat slammed into a bridge piling in Archers Creek, ejecting 19-year-old Mallory Beach into the dark water, where she died. The incident shattered the community's perception of the Murdaughs. Paul was awaiting trial for felony boating under the influence, facing the prospect of prison. More dangerously for Alex, the Beach family had filed a wrongful death lawsuit seeking to pierce the corporate veil, a legal maneuver that would compel Alex to open his financial books and reveal his insolvency. Paul was a polarizing figure, known for a reckless alter ego that emerged when he drank, which his friends referred to as Timmy. He was the source of the family's stress and the key to their potential financial ruin. The stage for the tragedy was Moselle. Located at 41147 Moselle Road in Islington, the property was isolated, a vast tract of land managed for deer, turkey and dove hunting. It was here, on the night of June 7, 2021, that the timeline of the trial began. At 10:07 p.m., Alex Murdaugh placed a frantic 911 call. He reported that he had returned home from visiting his ailing mother to find his wife and son shot near the dog kennels, a quarter of a mile from the main house. The scene that first responders encountered was one of clinical brutality. Paul Murdaugh lay in the feed room of the kennels. He had been shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun. The first shot struck his chest. The second, a catastrophic contact wound, entered his neck and blew through the base of his skull, exiting the top of his head. His brain was severed from his body, landing near his feet. Yards away, Maggie Murdaugh lay face down in the dirt. She had been executed with a .300 Blackout assault rifle. She had been shot 5 times, including bullets that passed through her wrist and torso, with a final round delivered into the back of her head as she lay on the ground. The shell casings found around her body matched the specific caliber and brand of ammunition used by the family, and the weapon was believed to be a replacement rifle Alex had purchased for Paul, though the gun itself was missing. The investigation was immediately complicated by the Murdaugh influence. The initial officers on the scene were men who had known Alex for decades, men who deferred to him. However, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, took lead on the case. The prosecution would eventually be spearheaded by Creighton Waters, a chief attorney for the state grand jury. Waters was a man of slight build but immense intensity, known for his bulldog tenacity and a mastery of complex financial trails. He approached the case not just as a double homicide, but as the violent culmination of a white-collar collapse. Opposing him was a defense team of legendary status. Dick Harpootlian, a state senator and veteran trial lawyer, brought a scorched earth style to the courtroom, adept at misdirection and aggressive cross-examination. Alongside him was Jim Griffin, a polished and methodical litigator. Their strategy was rooted in the lack of direct forensic evidence. There was no murder weapon found. There was no blood spatter on the clothing Alex Murdaugh wore when police arrived. A clean white t-shirt and shorts. There were no eyewitnesses. The central pillar of the defense, and the context that would define the early stages of the trial, was Alex Murdaugh's alibi. From the moment the first deputy arrived, Alex was consistent. He claimed he had eaten dinner with Paul and Maggie, then fell asleep on the couch while they went down to the kennels. He stated he woke up, tried to call them, and then left the property at approximately 9:07 p.m. to drive to Almeda to visit his mother, who was in the late stages of Alzheimer's. He claimed he returned to Moselle around 10 CUE p.m., drove to the kennels, and discovered the bodies. He was adamant. He was never at the dog kennels that night. He wasn't there when the shots were fired. This denial was the bedrock of the entire case. The prosecution had to prove he was there, but they had no physical evidence placing him at the scene at the estimated time of death, which the coroner placed roughly around 8:50 p.m. The gap between the main house and the kennels was too great to traverse quickly without a vehicle, and the data from Alex's Chevrolet Suburban seemed to support his driving timeline. The state was building a case on motive, the distraction from the financial crimes, but without presence, motive was insufficient. The trial was poised to be a battle over circumstantial ambiguity, with the defense prepared to argue that unknown vigilantes, perhaps seeking revenge for the boat crash, had slipped into the darkness of Moselle. The entire defense rested on the assertion that Alex Murdaugh was asleep at the main house while his family was being slaughtered. It was a story that held together, provided no one could prove he was lying about those critical minutes before he started his car. The humidity on the night of June 7, 2021, hung heavy over the low country of South Carolina, a thick blanket of moisture that amplified the silence of the swamp surrounding the Moselle estate. This was a property of vast acreage, a hunting lodge situated in Islandton, a place where the darkness is absolute once the sun dips below the tree line. At 10:07 p.m., that silence was shattered not by a gunshot, but by a frantic transmission across the emergency band of Colleton County. Alex Murdaugh, a scion of one of the most powerful legal dynasties in the state, was on the line with 911 dispatchers. His voice pitched high, oscillating between panic and command. He reported finding his wife, Maggie, and his youngest son, Paul, shot dead near the dog kennels on the property. The first officer to respond was Sergeant Daniel Green of the Colleton County Sheriff's Office. As his cruiser rolled down the long, winding gravel driveway, the headlights cut through the gloom to reveal a scene that would confound investigators for months. The body camera footage from that night records the crunch of tires on gravel and the immediate, jarring visual of Alex Murdaugh standing near his Chevrolet Suburban. He was wearing a white t-shirt and shorts, seemingly frantic, pacing the ground that was rapidly becoming a crime scene. Green noted almost immediately that despite the carnage Alex claimed to have checked, the man appeared remarkably clean. There was no visible blood on his clothing, a forensic anomaly that would later become a cornerstone of the state's suspicion. But in those initial chaotic moments, the focus was on the victims. The scene at the kennels was one of extreme military-grade violence. Paul Murdaugh lay near the feed room. The forensic assessment of his injuries indicated he had been shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun. The first shot was survivable, striking his chest and arm, but the second was catastrophic. The blast had entered the shoulder and neck area, traveling upward with such velocity that it severed the brain from the brainstem, causing immediate death and leaving biological material scattered across the ceiling of the feed room and the door. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was an obliteration. Only yards away, Maggie Murdaugh had been felled by a different weapon entirely. She had been shot multiple times with a .300 Blackout assault rifle, a caliber consistent with an AR-15 platform. The ballistics suggested she had been running, or perhaps backing away, as the initial shot struck her thigh and abdomen. The final shot, delivered while she was likely on the ground, was an execution-style round to the back of the head. The clinical precision of the kill shot stood in stark contrast to the chaotic nature of the environment. Spent shell casings lay in the dirt, brass markers of a dual-weapon assault that suggested either two shooters or a single shooter proficient enough to switch weapons with tactical speed. As the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, took command of the scene, the investigation pivoted from emergency response to forensic excavation. The weather threatened to compromise the site as a light rain began to fall, forcing investigators to work with urgency to tent the bodies and preserve the integrity of the soil. They were looking for footprints, tire tracks, any sign of an intruder who had slipped into the estate to butcher a mother and son. Yet, the physical evidence was confusing. There were no defensive wounds on the victims. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing had been stolen. The expensive weapons and equipment in the open feed room were untouched. The narrative established by Alex Murdaugh in those early hours was simple and, on the surface, plausible. He told investigators, including SLED Special Agent David Owen, that he had not been at the kennels prior to finding the bodies. He claimed he had eaten dinner with Paul and Maggie at the main house, roughly a third of a mile away from the kennels. After dinner, he said, Maggie went to the kennels to run the dogs, and Paul went to work on the property. Alex stated he fell asleep on the couch while watching television. When he woke up, he tried to call Maggie, but she didn't answer. He then drove to his mother's home in Alameda, a roughly 20-minute drive, to check on her as she was suffering from late-stage Alzheimer's. It was only upon his return to Moselle, shortly after 10:00 p.m., that he drove down to the kennels and discovered the horrific scene. This timeline became the bedrock of his defense. If Alex was at the main house napping and then driving to Alameda, he could not have been the shooter. The window of death, established by the cessation of phone activity for both victims, was narrowed down to approximately 8:50 p.m. Alex's phone showed movement steps and a departure from the house shortly after 9:00 p.m. The alibi seemed tight, protected by the digital footprint of his car and his phone, and the absence of direct physical evidence linking him to the weapons, which were missing from the scene. For months, the investigation seemed to stall in the public eye, though SLED agents were methodically dissecting the electronic lives of the Murdaugh family. They subpoenaed cell phone carriers, extracted data from the Chevrolet Suburban's OnStar system, and analyzed the telemetry of the phones involved. They were building a digital reconstruction of the night, minute by minute. One major hurdle, however, was Paul Murdaugh's cell phone. The device, an iPhone, had been found resting on his back pocket. It was locked with a passcode, and because Paul was deceased, the investigators could not simply ask for the code. In the immediate aftermath, the phone was secured in a Faraday bag to prevent remote wiping, but the encryption proved a formidable barrier. The investigation moved into a phase of tedious technical warfare. SLED's cybercrimes unit, led by Lieutenant Britt Dove, worked to bypass the security features of the device. This process is not instantaneous. It requires specialized software and legal warrants, often involving brute force algorithms that can take weeks or months to succeed. While this technical struggle ensued, Alex Murdaugh remained a free man, garnering sympathy as the grieving father and husband. He gave interviews, he cried, and he maintained his story with absolute consistency. He was never at the kennels that night until he found the bodies. The turning point, the moment that the entire architecture of the defense began to crumble, occurred when the digital forensics team finally breached the encryption on Paul's phone. It was a breakthrough that happened quietly in a lab, far from the dramatic fanfare of a courtroom, but its implications were nuclear. Upon extracting the data, Lieutenant Dove and his team began to catalog the user activity for June 7th. They saw texts, calls, and app usage. Then they found a video file. The metadata timestamp on the video was 8:44:55 p.m. This was mere minutes before the phone locked forever, mere minutes before the state believed Paul and Maggie were murdered. The video had not been sent to anyone. It was a rough clip, likely intended for a friend, showing a dog belonging to a friend of Paul's that they were watching. The dog, a chocolate Labrador named Bubba, had caught a chicken, a guinea fowl, in its mouth. Investigators pressed play. The video is shaky, vertical, the camera moving erratically as Paul tries to manage the dog. The visual information is gruesome in hindsight, the very ground where Paul would die minutes later. But it was the audio that stopped the investigators in their tracks. The sensory details of the recording were crisp. You could hear the rustling of the wind, the distress of the chicken, and the commands being shouted at the dog. 3 voices were audible on the recording. The first voice was Paul, frustrated, trying to get the bird out of the dog's mouth. The second voice was Maggie, distinctive and clear, commenting on the dog's behavior. But there was a third voice, a male voice, a baritone drawl that was unmistakable to anyone who knew the family. The voice shouted, "Hey, he's got a bird," and then, "Bubba, drop it." This 58-second clip was the smoking gun. It placed Alex Murdaugh at the murder scene at 8:44 p.m. This directly contradicted every statement he had made to law enforcement since the night of the killings. He had sworn repeatedly and unequivocally that he stayed at the house and never went to the kennels. He had built his entire alibi on the premise of absence. The video proved presence. To confirm the identification, investigators did not rely solely on their own ears. They brought in witnesses who had known Alex for decades. They played the audio for friends, for partners at his law firm, and even for family members. The consensus was absolute. Without hesitation, witness after witness identified the third voice as Alex Murdaugh. There was no distortion, no ambiguity. It was him. The existence of this video forced a complete re-evaluation of the timeline. If Alex was at the kennels at 8:45 p.m. and the shooting stopped phone activity by 8:49 p.m., the window for an intruder to enter, commit the murders and leave without Alex seeing them, or Alex leaving without seeing the bodies, vanished. The video placed him in the kill zone. At the exact moment the state argued the murders were taking place. The revelation of the kennel video also cast a sinister light on the other digital evidence SLED had collected. Suddenly, the telemetry from Alex's phone and car took on a new, darker meaning. The data showed that Alex's phone was largely inactive from 8:09 p.m. to 9:02 p.m. However, the step counter on his phone recorded a burst of activity shortly after 9 p.m., just as he was preparing to leave for his mother's house. The prosecution theorized that he had left his phone at the main house to create a digital alibi, while he went down to the kennels to commit the murders. The video on Paul's phone was the phantom witness that proved he was there when his own phone said he was idle. Furthermore, the OnStar data from the Suburban became critical. It showed the vehicle being shifted out of park at 9:06 p.m. This tight timeline meant that if Alex was at the kennels at 8:45 p.m., he had less than 20 minutes to commit the murders, return to the house, clean himself up, dispose of the weapons and bloody clothing, and get into his car to drive to Alameda. It explained the frenetic pace of the Suburban as it sped down the country roads, data that showed him driving well over the speed limit, braking aggressively. It wasn't a man leisurely visiting his sick mother. It was a man racing to establish an alibi and perhaps dispose of evidence along the rural route. The clothes became a renewed point of focus. In the body cam footage from Sergeant Green, Alex is wearing a clean white t-shirt. But in a Snapchat video Paul had sent earlier in the evening, Alex was seen wearing different clothes, long pants and a blue button-down shirt. Those clothes were never found. The kennel video confirmed he was active and outdoors minutes before the murder, yet he appeared fresh and showered when police arrived. The discrepancy was impossible to reconcile with innocence. A man who had just wrestled a chicken away from a dog at the kennels in the humid June heat would not be dry and clean unless he had changed. The psychological impact of the kennel video on the trial cannot be overstated. It is rare in criminal jurisprudence for a piece of evidence to so thoroughly dismantle a defendant's narrative. Usually, cases are built on circumstantial bricks: motive, opportunity, means. The kennel video was different. It was a lie detector test that the defendant had failed retroactively. It stripped Alex Murdaugh of his credibility entirely. When he eventually took the stand in his own defense, a desperate Hail Mary move, he was forced to admit that he lied. He had to look the jury in the eye and confess that for 2 years he had lied to SLED, lied to his family, and lied to the world about being at the kennels. He blamed his opioid addiction and paranoia for the lie, claiming he didn't want to be a suspect. But the damage was done. The video had forced him to change his story in the middle of the trial, a fatal maneuver for any defense team. The content of the video also provided a chilling glimpse into the family dynamic moments before the slaughter. There was no screaming, no argument recorded. It was a mundane domestic scene. They were worrying about a dog and a chicken. This normalcy made the subsequent violence even more jarring. It suggested that the murders were not the result of a sudden, heated argument that spiraled out of control, but rather a cold, calculated ambush. The transition from Bubba, drop it, to the roar of a 12-gauge shotgun happened in a span of roughly 4 minutes. The investigation also utilized the background sounds of the video to analyze the acoustics of the property. Experts analyzed the ambient noise to confirm the location was indeed the kennels, ruling out any possibility that the audio was recorded elsewhere. The distinct echo of the tin roof of the kennel shed, the specific gravel crunch, all matched the physical characteristics of the crime scene. This left the defense with no room to maneuver. They could not claim the video was from a different time. The metadata was locked. They could not claim it was a different place. The GPS and visual landmarks were undeniable. They could not claim it wasn't Alex. The voice was distinct. This piece of digital evidence did more than just place Alex at the scene. It recontextualized the entire investigation for the jury. It validated the state's theory of the family annihilator. It bridged the gap between the clean, grieving husband found by Sergeant Green and the brutal reality of the crime scene. Without the video, the case was a collection of oddities: missing clothes, financial crimes, and strange behavior. With the video, the case was a timeline of execution. The shocking reveal of the kennel video serves as a testament to the modern era of forensics, where the most damning witnesses are often the devices we carry in our pockets. Paul Murdaugh, in his final moments, unknowingly captured the voice of his killer. The phone, lying near his body in the dirt, held the secret that would eventually pierce the shield of privilege and power that surrounded Alex Murdaugh. It lay there through the rain, through the initial chaos, and through the months of legal wrangling. A digital time capsule waiting to be opened. When it finally was, it didn't just speak. It screamed the truth that changed the entire trial. The investigation revealed that the phone locked at 8:49:01 p.m. This precise second marks the end of Paul Murdaugh's digital life. It is the silence that follows the video. The juxtaposition of the casual, frustrated banter in the video against the absolute digital silence that followed less than 5 minutes later provided the prosecution with a timeline so tight, so unforgiving, that no amount of legal rhetoric could expand it. The video was the anchor. It held the ship of the defense in place, while the prosecution fired volley after volley of circumstantial evidence, knowing that the defendant could not move, could not run, and could not lie his way out of the one fact that mattered. He was there. As the trial progressed, the kennel video was played repeatedly. It became the soundtrack of the courtroom. "Hey, Bubba, he's got a bird." These mundane phrases took on a haunting quality. They were the last words spoken in a family unit before it was destroyed. For the jurors, the video transported them from the sterile environment of the courthouse to the humid, buggy air of Moselle. It allowed them to stand next to Paul. It allowed them to hear Maggie. And most critically, it allowed them to sense the presence of Alex, looming in the background, a presence that he had fought so hard to erase. The retrieval of this data by Linton Dove required navigating the complex proprietary software of Apple, a company known for its refusal to create backdoors for law enforcement. The success of the extraction was not guaranteed. Had the passcode remained a mystery, or had the data been corrupted, Alex Murdaugh might have maintained his alibi indefinitely. The clean shirt, the visit to his mother, the naps, it all might have been enough to sow reasonable doubt. But the binary code inside the iPhone did not care about the Murdaugh legacy or legal strategies. It simply stored the reality of 8:44 p.m. This chapter of the investigation underscores the fragility of truth in homicide cases. It often hangs by a thread, a single shell casing, a drop of blood, or in this case, a 58-second video clip of a dog and a chicken. The revelation of this evidence did not just change the trial. It ended the mystery. It converted a whodunit into a how did he do it. It stripped away the veneer of the grieving father and exposed the calculator underneath. The kennel video remains the definitive artifact of the Murdaugh murders, a piece of shocking evidence that ensured the voice of the victims would be heard over the lies of the survivor. The timeline was set, the location was fixed, the voices were identified. The trap, unknowingly set by Paul Murdaugh moments before his death, had finally sprung. The atmosphere inside the Colleton County Courthouse on the evening of March 2nd, 2023, had solidified into a heavy, suffocating anticipation. For 6 weeks, the jury had absorbed a labyrinthine narrative of financial ruin, opioid addiction, and familial betrayal. But it was the digital forensic evidence that had severed the defense's timeline. The kennel video, a piece of data pulled from Paul Murdaugh's phone, had placed the defendant at the scene of the crime minutes before the murders, obliterating his alibi. Now, The courtroom awaited the result of that revelation. The clock ticked past 7:01 p.m. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours, a speed that stunned legal observers and signaled a decisive rejection of the defense's convoluted explanations. When the jury buzzer sounded, indicating a verdict had been reached, the heir left the room. Richard Alexander Murdaugh stood at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys, Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. Murdaugh, a man who had once wielded immense power in this very judicial circuit, now stood as a diminished figure in a slate-blue blazer, his tall frame slightly hunched. He rocked back and forth on his heels, a nervous tic that had become familiar to those watching the proceedings. Judge Clifton Newman took the bench, his demeanor as unreadable and stoic as it had been throughout the grueling trial. He instructed the clerk of court, Rebecca Hill, to publish the verdict. The clinical precision of the legal ritual began. Hill's voice was steady as she read the first count regarding the murder of Maggie Murdaugh. Guilty. Murdaugh's face remained a mask, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Hill continued to the second count, the murder of his son, Paul. Guilty. The counts for possession of a weapon followed, adding 2 more guilty verdicts to the ledger. There was no outburst from the gallery, only a collective intake of breath. The once prominent solicitor's dynasty had officially collapsed under the weight of a double homicide conviction. Murdaugh blinked rapidly, his lips pursed, but offered no tears. Judge Newman thanked the jury for their service, noting that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming, specifically citing the kennel video that the defendant had lied about for months. The judge denied the defense's immediate motion for a mistrial with a swiftness that bordered on dismissal. Murdaugh was handcuffed, the metallic click echoing in the silent room, and led out a convicted double murderer. The drama reached its zenith the following morning, March 3, 2023, during the sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed, the humidity of the South Carolina low country pressing against the windows. Murdaugh returned, stripped of his suit, now wearing a tan prison jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to his waist. The visual transformation was jarring. The veneer of the respectable lawyer was gone, replaced by the reality of a state inmate. Prosecutor Creighton Waters rose to address the court. He declined to call members of the victim's family to speak, a strategic move to protect them from future legal entanglements. But he spoke passionately on behalf of the state. Waters described Murdaugh as a cunning manipulator who had used his badge and his family name to evade accountability for decades. He argued that the depravity of the crime, a father executing his wife and son to distract from his financial crimes, warranted the maximum penalty. Waters asked for 2 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that Murdaugh would never breathe free air again. When it was the defense's turn, Murdaugh stood to speak. He maintained his innocence, clinging to the narrative that had failed him the day before. He looked at Judge Newman and insisted he would never hurt his wife or son. It was a final, desperate attempt to salvage his character, but it fell on deaf ears. The judge, who had known Murdaugh professionally and had lost his own son recently, looked down from the bench with a gaze that was both pitiful and piercing. Judge Newman's sentencing monologue became the defining moment of the trial, a piece of judicial theatre that transcended the courtroom. He did not merely pass a sentence. He dismantled the defendant's psyche. Speaking with a calm, deliberate cadence, Judge Newman addressed the monster that Murdaugh had become when he took massive amounts of opioids. Yet he refused to let the drugs excuse the behavior. He focused on the lies. He looked directly at Murdaugh, and spoke about the haunting nature of the crimes. "I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the night time, when you're attempting to go to sleep," Judge Newman said, his voice resonating in the quiet room. "I'm sure they come and visit you." Murdaugh, still defiant, replied that he saw them every day and every night, attempting to twist the judge's words into a statement of grief. But Newman was relentless. He countered that the interactions Murdaugh was having were likely tormented ones, reflecting on the last thing Paul and Maggie saw before they died: the face of their husband and father wielding a rifle and a shotgun. The judge dismantled the defense's claim that Murdaugh was a loving father, juxtaposing the image of the family man with the forensic reality of the execution-style killings. He noted that Murdaugh's family had prosecuted people in this very courtroom for over a century, sentencing many to death for lesser crimes, and highlighted the irony that Murdaugh himself was now on the receiving end of that same justice system. The tension in the room was palpable as Newman prepared to deliver the sentence. He referenced the web of lies Murdaugh had spun, specifically citing the shocking evidence of the kennel video that proved Murdaugh was at the murder scene mere moments before the shots were fired. The judge stated that the defendant had engaged in a duplicitous life, deceiving his partners, his clients, and his family. There was no leniency to be found. Judge Newman pronounced the sentence: confinement in the State Department of Corrections for the rest of his natural life for the murder of Paul Murdaugh, and a consecutive sentence of life imprisonment for the murder of Maggie Murdaugh. The word consecutive was the final nail. It was a symbolic assurance that even if one conviction were overturned, the other would keep him behind bars. Murdaugh nodded slightly, his expression vacant. There was no screaming, no weeping from the gallery, only the scribbling of reporters and the silent sobbing of extended family members. The bailiffs moved in immediately. They took Murdaugh by the arms, guiding him away from the defense table where he had spent his career, and toward the side door leading to the holding cells. As he shuffled out, the chains around his waist clinking with every step, he did not look back at the gallery. The courtroom began to clear, the air slowly returning to the room. The prosecution team hugged, a release of tension that had built over months of investigation. Creighton Waters looked exhausted but satisfied. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the media frenzy was already dissecting the judge's words, broadcasting the haunting quote to the world. The trial of the century for the Low Country had concluded not with a whimper, but with a judicial condemnation that stripped Alex Murdaugh of every last vestige of his humanity. The shocking evidence of his voice on a cell phone video had not just proven his guilt, it had shattered a century-old dynasty and resulted in a courtroom finale that left the nation stunned by the cold, clinical reality of justice served. The van carrying Murdaugh departed shortly after, driving past the crowds and the cameras, taking him to the Kirkland Correctional Institution to begin processing as inmate number 003903994. The gavel fell in the Durham County Superior Court, but this time the sound did not signal a condemnation. It signaled a collapse. The 2011 ruling by Judge Orlando Hudson to vacate the murder conviction of Michael Peterson was not merely a procedural adjustment, but the detonation of a forensic cornerstone that had supported the prosecution's case for nearly a decade. The shocking evidence that changed the entire trajectory of the trial was not a newfound weapon or a surfacing witness, but the discovery of a systemic rot within the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. The legacy of the Peterson case, therefore, ceased to be defined solely by the mysterious lacerations on Kathleen Peterson's scalp. shifting instead to the devastating exposure of Special Agent Duane Deaver and the subsequent implosion of bloodstain pattern analysis as an unimpeachable science in the state of North Carolina. To understand the aftermath, one must examine the vacuum left by the discrediting of the prosecution's star expert. During the original 2003 trial, Duane Deaver had testified with absolute certainty that the blood spatter found inside the stairwell at 1810 Cedar Street was consistent only with a beating, specifically asserting that the void patterns and cast-off stains proved Michael Peterson had struck his wife to death. This testimony was the fulcrum upon which the jury's guilty verdict balanced. However, the legacy of this trial began to rewrite itself when defense attorney David Rudolph and his team unearthed the empirical reality behind Deaver's assertions. The shocking evidence was negative data. Specifically, the test results Deaver had deliberately withheld from the defense, the prosecution, and the jury. The clinical auditing of Deaver's files revealed a pattern of confirmation bias so severe it bordered on fabrication. It came to light that Deaver had conducted multiple experiments attempting to replicate the blood spatter patterns he claimed proved a beating. In these controlled tests, he had beaten sponges soaked in blood and assaulted styrofoam heads to generate cast-off. Crucially, in several of these reenactments, the resulting spatter patterns did not match the crime scene. In a standard scientific inquiry, these negative results would necessitate a revision of the hypothesis or, at the very least, full disclosure to peer reviewers. Instead, Deaver omitted these non-conforming results from his final reports. The jury in 2003 was presented with a curated reality, a sanitized version of science, where the data fit the theory perfectly, because the contradictory data had been erased. The legal precedent established in the wake of this revelation was profound. Judge Hudson's decision to grant a new trial was based on the premise that a defendant's due process rights are violated when the state's expert witness misrepresents the scientific certainty of their findings and conceals exculpatory bench notes. This ruling sent a shockwave through the American legal system regarding the discovery process. It established a stricter standard for forensic transparency, reinforcing the mandate that defense teams must have access not just to the final forensic report, but to the raw data, the bench notes, and the failed experiments that led to the expert's conclusion. The Peterson case effectively put the black box of forensic labs on trial, demanding that the inner workings of state analysis be visible to the scrutiny of the defense. The aftermath extended far beyond the walls of the Peterson courtroom. The exposure of Duane Deaver triggered a massive independent audit of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, spearheaded by former FBI agents Chris Swecker and Michael Wolff. This audit, known as the Swecker Report, was the direct legacy of the Peterson defense team's discovery. The auditors combed through thousands of cases and identified approximately 230 files where blood analysis was critical. They found that the withholding of negative results and the exaggeration of findings were not isolated to the Peterson trial, but were a pervasive cultural issue within the bloodstain pattern analysis unit. The human cost of this forensic negligence became painfully clear in the case of Greg Taylor, a man convicted of murder in 1993. The audit prompted by the Peterson case revealed that Deaver had also handled the evidence in Taylor's trial. Deaver had reported finding human blood on Taylor's SUV, a critical piece of evidence that helped secure a conviction. However, the audit uncovered Deaver's bench notes, which showed that a confirmatory Takayama test had actually returned a negative result. Deaver had hidden the fact that the substance was not blood, allowing an innocent man to languish in prison for 17 years. Greg Taylor's exoneration became inextricably linked to the Peterson saga, a grim testament to the power of the shocking evidence uncovered by David Rudolph. The legacy of the Peterson trial, therefore, includes the freedom of a man who had nothing to do with the staircase, but was a victim of the same corrupted science. Following these revelations, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation underwent a radical restructuring. The bloodstain pattern analysis unit was suspended, and its operations were scrutinized under new accreditation standards. The legal system was forced to grapple with the CSI effect in reverse, where juries once blindly trusted the authoritative demeanor of a frantic specialist in a lab coat. The Peterson aftermath instilled a necessary cynicism. Defense attorneys across the country began citing the Diva debacle in cross-examinations, challenging experts to prove that their reports contained the totality of their testing and not just the successful results. The trial's legacy became a warning label on forensic testimony. Authority is not evidence, and a badge does not validate bad science. For Michael Peterson, the legal aftermath dragged on for 6 more years after the verdict was vacated. He was released from prison in 2011 and placed under house arrest, living in a strange limbo while the state decided whether to retry a case that had been hollowed out by the discredit of its primary forensic narrative. The prosecution faced an insurmountable hurdle. Without Diva's testimony to scientifically choreograph a beating, they were left with a circumstantial case and a compromised crime scene. The physical evidence, the blood, remained, but the translator of that evidence had been proven a fraud. This deadlock led to the final anticlimactic legal resolution of the case in February 2017, the Alford plea. This specific legal mechanism allows a defendant to maintain their assertion of innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to likely secure a conviction, effectively ending the legal battle without a confession of guilt. The courtroom scene in 2017 was a stark contrast to the high-voltage drama of 2003. There were no elaborate slideshows of blood trajectories, no thunderous closing arguments about blowpokes. There was only the quiet procedural recitation of rights. Michael Peterson sat before Judge Orlando Hudson, the same judge who had presided over the original trial and the retrial hearing, and formally entered the plea to voluntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to 86 to 104 months, a sentence Peterson had already exceeded during his 8 years of imprisonment. He was a free man, technically a convicted felon in the eyes of the law, yet he walked out of the courthouse maintaining he had never hurt Kathleen. The Alford plea served as a complex, unsatisfying capstone to the trial's legacy. It denied the public the binary closure of a guilty or not guilty verdict in a retrial, leaving the truth of what happened on the staircase forever suspended in a fog of legal compromise. However, from a jurisprudential standpoint, the plea was a direct consequence of the evidentiary implosion. The state could not risk a retrial with their forensic credibility in tatters, and the defense could not risk the gamble of a jury trial, where emotional bias might override technical doubts. The legacy of the case also reshaped the public consumption of true crime and legal proceedings. The exhaustive documentation of the trial and its aftermath provided a clinical look at the grinding machinery of the justice system. It stripped away the glamour of courtroom dramas, revealing the exorbitant financial and emotional costs of high-stakes litigation. Viewers and legal students alike were forced to confront the reality that a trial is not always a search for truth, but a contest of narratives where the suppression of a single variable, a negative control test, can alter the fate of a human life. Furthermore, the case highlighted the critical importance of evidence preservation. The ability of the defense to re-examine the physical evidence and the paper trail nearly a decade later was the only safeguard against a permanent miscarriage of justice. Had the files been destroyed or the bench notes discarded as irrelevant, the corruption of the SBI would have remained buried and Michael Peterson would have died in prison. This has led to more robust preservation orders in capital cases, ensuring that the raw materials of forensic science remain accessible for future review as technology and standards evolve. The vivid imagery of the Peterson trial, the white walls of the staircase splattered with red, the rusted blowpoke found in the garage, the owl feather theory, remains etched in the cultural consciousness. Yet, the enduring substance of Chapter 4, the legacy phase, is found in the dry, dusty boxes of the SBI archives. It is found in the revised protocols of crime labs that now require blind verification of results. It is found in the heightened skepticism of judges regarding who they allow to be qualified as an expert witness. The shocking evidence that changed the trial was not the blood itself, but the revelation of how the blood was interpreted. In the final analysis, the aftermath of State v. Peterson serves as a permanent scar on the face of forensic jurisprudence in North Carolina. It dismantled the infallibility of the state expert. It proved that science, when wielded by those with a vested interest in the outcome, can be as malleable and dangerous as any weapon. The conviction was vacated, the expert was fired, the lab was audited, and the laws were adjusted. But the question of absolute truth remains unanswered. The legal precedent set here ensures that in future courtrooms, when an expert points to a chart and claims scientific certainty, the defense will ask the question that saved Michael Peterson. Where are the notes for the test that didn't work? That question is the true legacy of the trial, a safeguard forged in the failure of the system to police itself. The trial ended not with a bang, but with a signature on a plea deal. Yet its echoes continue to resonate every time a forensic scientist takes the stand, raising their right hand to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and, most importantly, the parts of the truth they tried to hide. The conviction of Alex Murdaugh at the Colleton County Courthouse marked the final collapse of a legal dynasty that had reigned over the South Carolina Low Country for a century, while the double life sentences delivered a legal conclusion to the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. The mechanism of that verdict remains the true focal point of historical analysis. The prosecution's case, initially constructed on a complex web of circumstantial financial motive and disputed blood spatter theories, ultimately hinged on the digital phantom recovered from the victim's iPhone. The kennel video, recorded at 8:44 p.m., dismantled the defendant's alibi with the clinical precision of a surgeon's scalpel. That single digital file did not merely contradict Alex Murdaugh's sworn testimony. It highlighted the dangerous gaps in the initial investigation, where the preservation of the crime scene at the Moselle estate was compromised by familial deference and a lack of procedural rigor. The video bypassed the mud, the rain, and the contaminated physical evidence to deliver an unassailable acoustic truth. The trial serves as a stark meditation on the fragility of justice in the digital age. In a system designed to weigh reasonable doubt, the scales were tipped not by traditional detective work, but by the casual, unintended documentation of a victim moments before his death. As the transport van carried Murdaugh away from Walterboro, a terrifying counter-narrative settled over the courtroom observers. The entire trajectory of the trial relied on a technological fluke. Had Paul Murdaugh not impulsively lifted his phone to record a friend's dog in those final minutes, The critical timestamp would never have existed. The lie would have remained unchallenged, and the secrets of the Moselle kennels would likely have remained buried in the dark soil of the Low Country forever.